Operation Cyclone. In the days right after the Chernobyl disaster, a secret mission was happening way up high above the radioactive mess. Soviet Tu-16 bomber planes, which were usually used for long-range military attacks, this time took off with a new, really important job: to make it rain. The operation was led by Yuri Israel, who was the head of the Soviet State Committee for Hydrometeorology. 2 days after the explosion of the fourth reactor, a secret map appeared on his desk. It showed that the radioactive cloud was moving towards Moscow. Millions of lives were in danger in the city, which was just preparing for the annual parade on Red Square, an event that could not be cancelled to avoid international embarrassment for the Soviet government. Israel issued a fateful order: let it rain before the toxic clouds reach the capital. Just 48 hours after the explosion of the fourth reactor, the operation began. Artillery shells filled with silver iodide were loaded into Tu-16 bombers at a Moscow airbase, and Soviet pilots set off to intercept the radioactive clouds. First, they circled the burning reactor within a radius of approximately 10 kilometers, but the wind constantly pushed the radioactive mass further. Therefore, the crews had to follow the black clouds hundreds of kilometers away. Once they caught up, they released the silver iodide, which acted like ice crystals, causing water vapor to condense and subsequently rain. Villagers in the town of Norovlia, just 50 kilometers north of Chernobyl, watched with bewildered amazement as the sky filled with strange yellow and grey condensation trails. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the clouds broke and a heavy downpour began. Thunder roared across the landscape and black rain poured from the sky, washing radioactive particles from the air and depositing them into the soil. These were not the first attempts by the Soviet Air Force to influence the weather. They had been experimenting with its manipulation since 1941, and during the Moscow Olympic Games in 1980, the same Tu-16 bombers were used to clear the sky over the city. However, Operation Cyclone posed a much greater risk. The rain carried not only water, but also a deadly mixture of radioactive isotopes, including cesium-137 and iodine-131. The rain clouds, which were artificially created, dumped radioactive fallout across the entire region of Belarus. Moscow was spared, but entire villages found themselves under streams of radioactive precipitation. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the opposite weather modification operation was underway. Pilots from the Hydrometeorological Institute, this time in civilian aircraft, were tasked with stopping rain clouds instead of creating them. Storms were spreading radiation into the Pripyat River, a key water source for Ukraine. To prevent rain, they dropped tons of cement 600 mixture, which contained cement and drying agents, into the clouds. This strange attempt to dry out the sky caused a 5-month drought in some parts of Ukraine. The Soviet authorities desperately tried to control the spread of radiation by modifying the environment. By the winter of 1986, they had managed to protect Moscow, but the price was enormous. Belarusian villages soaked in radioactive rain recorded an increase in radiation levels 20 to 30 times above normal. Entire communities were left to their fate and faced dire consequences. The number of childhood cancer cases skyrocketed, and birth defects tragically became common. The Soviet authorities denied for many years that these weather modification operations had ever taken place. However, the truth left a terrifying legacy in the forgotten villages of Belarus, where the rain that saved millions of lives in Moscow came at a terrible cost. The first photography. For many years, the first photograph of the Chernobyl disaster remained shrouded in the same mystery as the tragedy itself. Igor Kostin's iconic shot, grainy and obscured by radiation, is often considered the very first photograph of the destroyed reactor. However, Kostin was not the only one with a camera that day, and his shot may not have been the first. In the early morning hours of April 26, 1986, Kostin, a photographer working for the Novosti news agency, received an urgent phone call. At 1 o'clock in the morning, an explosion had occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Later that morning or early afternoon, he was already sitting in a helicopter, flying over the smoldering ruins of the fourth reactor. The exact time remains unclear. As he leaned out of the helicopter window with his medium-format Kiev 6 camera, he later described how a blast of hot air rushed into the cabin just as he took the shot that became one of the most famous images of the disaster. However, Kostin's mission did not go according to plan. After taking approximately 20 shots, his camera jammed. When he later developed the film, he discovered that almost all the photographs were ruined. Radiation had damaged most of his film. Only one terrifying photograph, taken approximately 14 hours after the explosion, survived. Another photographer who documented the disaster that day was Anatoly Raskazov. He may have taken the very first pictures of the destroyed reactor. As the official photographer of the power plant, he was called to the scene at 9 a.m. on April 26th and ordered to photograph from a helicopter. Just like Kostin, he leaned out fighting the stifling air while a soldier held his legs to prevent him from falling out. He used Kiev 6 and Zenit cameras. He later recalled that there was so much ash flying in the air that it was impossible to photograph through the glass. The helicopter hovered just 200 meters from the reactor, so close that the radiation began to burn his skin. The first roll of film that Raskazov shot with the Zenit camera was completely black, burned by radiation. "I thought it was the end, that everything was lost," he later recalled. However, the second film taken with the Kiev 6 yielded usable shots. Although shrouded in haze, they were still clear enough to reveal the extent of the devastation below. After returning to the ground, Raskazov continued to document the disaster. He ventured dangerously close to the reactor in a fire truck. His photographs captured blocks of graphite that had been ejected from the reactor core, as well as the destruction surrounding the fourth reactor. Unlike Kostin's famous shot, however, Raskazov's work disappeared into Soviet secrecy. When he handed over his photographs to the power plant director Viktor Bruchanov, Soviet security forces immediately confiscated them. Raskazov was forbidden to speak about what he had seen. His images remained secret for years. Despite the strict secrecy, his photographs played a crucial role in the Soviet authorities' efforts to understand the scale of the disaster. Yet it was not until many years later that some of his photographs quietly leaked to the public without his name being mentioned. So which photograph was truly the first? Kostin's shot is the one most often associated with the disaster and often labeled as the first. However, Raskazov's photographs taken several hours earlier challenged this claim. Regardless of which was first, both men risked their lives and paid a high price with their own health so that the world could see the truth. The secret convoy. It was a deep night, and Kiev slept. A convoy of 30 trucks rolled through the silent streets, each carrying a deadly top-secret cargo. At the head of the column sat Lieutenant Colonel Viktor Gersnev, gripping the steering wheel of a military vehicle, his dosimeter emitting a continuous warning screech. However, the danger was not only radiation. Among them were weapons capable of unimaginable destruction. 3 days after the explosion of the fourth reactor, Soviet forces desperately tried to secure their military equipment. Gersnev received clear orders: evacuate the missiles, 27 with conventional warheads and 3 with nuclear warheads, from an air defense base near Chernobyl. These missiles were part of the S-75 Dvina system, which was infamously known. It was a missile of the same type that shot down an American U-2 spy plane in 1960, triggering the Cold War crisis. Now, as the convoy roared through the heart of Kiev, a new crisis loomed. This time not from the west, but from within. The radioactive cloud that had enveloped the entire region was rapidly approaching. The men in the convoy knew that their vehicles, missiles, and uniforms were covered in a layer of radioactive dust. They had spent hours in the contaminated zone without protective gear. Their only shield was the knowledge that an order is an order. The convoy nervously crept through the night. After almost 100 kilometers of travel from Chernobyl to Kiev, it entered the city under the cover of darkness. It crossed the Peyton Bridge, while 2 million residents of Kiev slept, unaware of the nuclear weapons passing through their streets. After 14 hours of slow movement at a speed of barely 30 kilometers per hour, the convoy finally arrived at the Boryspil Air Base. There, a special team immediately dismantled the S-75 missiles along with their nuclear warheads. However, there was no celebration for Gursnev and his men, only 2 bottles of red wine for the officers. The drivers received nothing. The men feverishly scrubbed their trucks, scrubbing until their hands bled, trying to remove the radioactive dust. Yet, the dosimeters continued to click frantically. Their task was not yet finished. Gursnev and his unit were sent back to Chernobyl to make 3 more trips for military equipment from the contaminated base. Each of these missions was fraught with the same silent terror. The S-75 missiles, capable of destroying entire squadrons of enemy aircraft, were considered too valuable to be left to their fate, regardless of the radiation. This system was a key element of the strategic defense of the Soviet Union, part of the Duga over-the-horizon radar, known as the Russian Woodpecker, which served to provide early detection of Western missile attacks. Now, however, this defense was crumbling, and the equipment was left to rust. The convoy's mission was never publicly acknowledged. Gursnev later described it as a futile operation that sacrificed men to save contaminated weapons. The real price was paid by the people. Many of the soldiers who participated in this mission later became seriously ill. Gursnev's driver, who was only 28 years old, died shortly after returning. "No one knows what we went through," Gursnev said bitterly years later. "We didn't save anyone. We didn't clean anything up." For 3 years, the contaminated trucks and equipment remained at the base in Boryspil, silently emitting radiation until they were finally disposed of in a junkyard of dirty vehicles. But by then, it was too late. The nuclear warheads were secured, but the men who carried out the mission were left to their fate. Their radiation exposure was the unspoken consequence of an operation that the world was never supposed to know about. The train full of meat. The summer of 1990 was hot in Ukraine. In a remote railway depot in the town of Poliske in northern Ukraine, a deserted row of broken refrigerated wagons stood, surrounded by ropes. Their contents were almost as dangerous as the fallout from the reactor that had exploded 4 years earlier. Inside lay 317 tons of radioactive meat, awaiting a fate that no one wanted to accept. This was not an isolated case, but part of a broader Soviet strategy to manage the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster by dispersing contaminated meat and agricultural products among an unsuspecting population. After the explosion of the 4th reactor in April 1986, life around Chernobyl changed overnight. 50,000 head of cattle were removed from the radioactive zone, not for disposal, as one might expect, but to slaughterhouses. Soviet officials devised a plan. Animals deemed too contaminated were processed in factories throughout Ukraine and Belarus, mixed with unirradiated meat, and turned into sausages. This strategy was terrifyingly simple. By diluting the radiation and dispersing it, they would ensure that no one noticed anything. Thus, people unknowingly consumed the very product of the disaster. Only the elite Soviet cities Moscow and Leningrad were spared the contaminated food. In the meatpacking plants, the work was exhausting and dangerous. Ill-equipped and poorly trained workers with dosimeters moved among the slaughterhouse hooks, while their devices beeped continuously, measuring the radiation in the meat. Amidst all this stood the workers, processing animals as quickly as possible to keep pace with the never-ending supply of contaminated bodies. Cows had grazed on radioactive meadows. Their meat had absorbed the fallout, and now it was being prepared for human consumption. By the summer of 1987, the system was overloaded. Freezer warehouses across the region were filled with meat that exceeded safe contamination limits. In Belarus, the meatpacking plant in Gomel faced an impossible choice: dispose of the radioactive meat as waste or try to move it somewhere. Desperate workers trying to get rid of the toxic meat loaded the supplies into refrigerated railway wagons and sent them south, hoping to unload them in Georgia. However, the cargo was immediately rejected there, and that was just the beginning of a multi-year odyssey. For the next 4 years, the train traveled across the Soviet railways, a problem that no one wanted. At each station, the same scene played out. Local officials with dosimeters in hand would run the devices over the refrigerated wagons and immediately reject the cargo. And so the meat continued on its journey, an endless cycle of bureaucratic indifference constantly moving from one station to another. In 1990, the KGB finally took control when the refrigeration units began to fail and the wagons were left standing in the already heavily contaminated area of northern Ukraine. Railway workers, aware of the invisible danger, refused to repair the refrigeration systems. The KGB therefore ordered the train to be moved to a remote part of Belarus, where a concrete-lined pit was dug into which the radioactive meat was buried deep underground. This meat train and thousands of tons of other contaminated meat and agricultural products were a desperate attempt by the Soviet Union to control something that was uncontrollable. A grim reminder that some tragedies cannot simply be swept under the rug. The blue flash. When the fourth reactor exploded, this catastrophic event caused shockwaves that spread throughout the facility, and radioactive debris flew into the clouds. But that night, there was something else that pierced the darkness, something that still provokes speculation decades later. Witnesses reported a blue flash, a phenomenon that suggests an even darker truth than what is presented in the official version. The widely accepted version of events describes a sequence that begins with a failed safety test. A power surge caused a steam explosion, followed by the melting of the reactor core. Radioactive material was thrown into the air in a second explosion of hydrogen gas, which was formed when the exposed nuclear fuel and graphite began to split water molecules. However, recent studies suggest a different sequence according to which the blue flash could be evidence of a nuclear detonation, not just a steam explosion. A local fisherman who was standing only about 5 kilometers from the blast site recalled hearing 2 explosions separated by a dazzling blue flash. Such testimonies led nuclear physicist Lars-Erik de Geer to suggest that this blue flash could have been the first sign of a nuclear explosion. De Geer and his team support this theory with radiation data from the Russian city of Cherepovets, which lies about 370 kilometers north of Moscow. Although Cherepovets lies outside the known fallout path, scientists detected traces of xenon-133, a radioactive isotope floating over the city 4 days after the explosion. This suggested that a powerful nuclear explosion had sent fallout to a height of over 3 kilometers from where it could have been carried by air currents in the upper layers of the atmosphere. Further evidence of the explosion's power can be found directly in the reactor itself. The blast was so strong that it ejected the 2,000-ton reactor lid into the air, where it landed almost vertically on the edge of the reactor vessel. Seismic data and the damage pattern inside the fourth reactor, including a torn, approximately 2-meter-thick steel plate, support the theory that a nuclear explosion preceded the steam explosion. The blue light around reactors is often associated with Cherenkov radiation, a characteristic phenomenon that occurs when charged particles, such as electrons, travel faster than light in a given medium. This blue glow is commonly observed in the cooling pools of nuclear reactors. Alexander Yuvchenko, one of the workers at the plant, saw such a blue glow and described how he ran out of the reactor building and saw a strange blue light hanging in the air. However, the initial blue light observed in Chernobyl may have been something much more serious, perhaps an immediate result of a nuclear explosion or intense heat and ionizing radiation heating the surrounding air rather than just a byproduct of the reactor accident. More than 3 decades after the disaster, many mysteries of Chernobyl remain unsolved. The debate about the blue flash, whether it was a warning of a nuclear explosion or just a terrifying flash from ionized air, still persists, just like the radiation that is now enclosed in the sarcophagus of the fourth reactor.